Hi, everybody. Hope you can all hear me okay. Waiting for everyone to come on Zoom. Have some people join us on Facebook and YouTube. It's be nice to see everyone tonight. I hope you're all hearing me okay. Let me know if you can't hear me. And for those of you on Zoom, I've enabled live transcriptions or closed captioning. So if you need that, just send me a little message and I'll turn it on for you. I'm seeing it here for myself, and someone just requested that. So if you need that, just let me know and I'll be happy to enable it for you. A new service from Live with Mrs. Q, closed captions. Hello to the Bronx. Everyone can hear me well. Excellent. Great. It's great to see everybody. I hope you like my new hairdo tonight. I worked on it today. Didn't have anything to do with this crazy gray, blue, white wig, so I decided to put it up in a nice big style. And I don't know if you can see the little curls back here, which was very fashionable at the time. So I decided to go back to a more refined look rather than that, wild wig I've been wearing for the last month or so that I really enjoy. But I thought I would look a little bit more distinguished as a lady if I put my hair up and put the little curls in the back. So I think it came out quite well. I hope you like it. Oh, people do. Great. Thank you. And with my little gold bed jacket, I just thought it would look a lot nicer tonight. Mrs. Healy is nodding her head. So thanks everyone for joining me. I'd like to let you know before we start that my next live appearance as Mrs. Q will be Saturday, July 9th with the Francis Tavern Museum. If you are a member of Francis Tavern Museum or you get their newsletter, the Museum Messenger, you'll see an announcement coming out for that. And in case you don't know, July 9th is the day the Declaration of Independence was read in New York City and the statue of King George III was torn down. So I will be walking through the town as Mrs. Q, talking about all of the events that led New York into the Revolutionary War, from the Stamp Act and the Liberty Pole to the Quartering Act, to the reading of the Declaration of Independence, a little bit about the Battle of New York in 1776, and we will be ending with Washington's farewell address at Francis Tavern Museum. So a great day. It's from 11 to 1, and that's July 9th, Saturday, and tickets will be on sale through Francis Tavern Museum. And of course, I'll be sharing the link to that when that's available, and I hope some of you will come out and enjoy a great summer day with me as Mrs. Q. I'll have a great time talking about the American Revolution. So tonight I thought I would talk. Oh, and I also want to thank you before I forget. What do I have? Has been enabled. Okay, I have a little thing just saying live transcript has been enabled. I've never done this before, so that's on. So I just want to thank all of you who've requested copies of my book, because I have run out and I just ordered more from Learner Publishing today. So I should have those back in stock in it takes about less than a week for me to get them. So if anyone wants a book, feel free to let me know. I'll have those back in stock. They've been selling very well on my Hamilton and Burr tour, and I have had a number of requests from all of you for them too. So thank you very much, because I do much better if you order the book from me than if you get it on Amazon, and I get, measly pennies on the dollar. So you can buy it from me and I do better, and you get a signed copy, and I gift wrap them and everything. They come very nicely. So let me know if you'd like a book in the future. I will have more to sell. Let me see. Do I have any messages over here? Oh, let's see. We have Georgia and people like my hair. Thank you. I think it came out pretty good. I worked on it all afternoon. There's a couple cushions in there to get it shaped all nice, but I think it looks pretty nice. Uh, let's see. The George Washington Prize for Literary Awards, the book Minds and Hearts, the stories of James Otis and Mary Otis Warren is a finalist. So that's Mr. White is letting me know about a book award and telling me that the story of James Otis and Mary Otis Warren is a finalist in the George Washington Prize for Literary Awards. So that's really great. A wonderful couple. And one night when I know more about her, I'll talk about Mercy Otis Warren. But there are many people who know a lot about her, and I don't want to make a fool of myself by saying things I don't know are correct. So tonight we're going to stick with the ladies of New York because I do know about the ladies of New York. And the last time I talked about the ladies of New York, I talked about Margaret Hardenbrook and I talked about Mrs. Alexander, Mary Sprott Provost Alexander. And so I thought I would talk about some more because that video did very well on Facebook and YouTube. So thank you, all of you who watched it. So I thought we'd talk about some more ladies tonight. And some of them you may not have heard of. One you've heard of, but I tried to pick a couple that you may not know about. And the first one is Mrs. Anazanger, the wife of the printer John Peter Zenger. And they were just little family printers here in New York City in the 1730s, printing their little weekly newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. And here is a picture of it for you. So there's the New York Weekly Journal. And of course, it came out weekly in 1734, and it was published by a young printer, John Peter Zenger. His wife assisted them, and they had a young assistant in the newspaper. And they were going along printing their newspaper, and it seems that they were financed by a group of New York lawyers, James Alexander and William Smith, and one of the Morrises, and I always forget the Morrises, one of the early Morrises. And Mr. Morris had been kicked off the Supreme Court of New York for various reasons. There were all kinds of lawsuits going on. It's a very long and involved story. But this issue of the New York Weekly Journal called out the governor, William Cosby, for fraud, embezzlement, all kinds of bad things that he was up to, including reneging on a judgment on a lawsuit and kicking the judge off the court that's decided against him. So this issue really makes fun of Governor Cosby, makes fun of his supporters. It's really quite entertaining. And of course, it's written by those lawyers, all under pseudonyms, right? Well, Governor Cosby became so enraged at this issue of the paper that he declared it to be sedition and libel, and he had every copy that could be found confiscated and burned, one saved for evidence. Mr. Zenger was arrested and jailed, and he had a bail hearing. And when Mr. Zenger came up for bail, they set the bail at 10 times what he would be able to afford. Because let me remind you that the purpose of jailing printers at that time was to keep the newspaper from being published. If the printer was in jail, the paper couldn't be published and it couldn't have things in it you didn't like. So the governors couldn't actually tell the printers what to print or not to print, but they could jail them to keep the paper from being printed. So that was the purpose of the extraordinarily high bail. So at that time, Mr. Zenger's two lawyers, Mr. Smith and Mr. Alexander, went to court to argue for fair bail for Mr. Zenger. And that is exactly what they said, was that bail is not meant to keep a man jailed, but to keep him from not showing up for trial, right? So it's like a deposit. You don't want to lose that deposit, so you can be sure the person will show up for trial, show up for court. And they also then argued that one of the justices on the court, the one that had replaced Mr. Morris, was illegally placed on the court by the Chief Justice. And of course, some of you know he was a Delancey. So the Delanceys are the big loyalist faction in New York in the 1730s. The court dismissed for the day, adjourned for the day, said they would be back the next morning. They came back the next morning. They upheld the bail and they disbarred Smith and Alexander from all practice in New York, both civil and criminal practice. An outrage. So now they assigned a lawyer to defend Mr. Zenger, who had never argued a case before, fresh at the bar of New York, while, of course, a Crown prosecutor was selected for the prosecution. Knowing this was not going to go well, Smith and Alexander and Mrs. Anazanger got in touch with Mr. Andrew Hamilton of Philadelphia, at that time the finest trial lawyer in America. He was also Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, and they asked him if he would defend Mr. Zenger. And Mr. Hamilton not only agreed to defend Mr. Zenger, he took the case free of charge, because he knew how important this case might be. He also said it would be very difficult for Mr. Delancey to expel the Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Assembly, the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, from his courtroom. And so off to New York came Mr. Hamilton. Now, the trial of Mr. Zenger was the, trial of the century, I guess we might call it. It was hugely popular, very exaggerated, a lot of courtroom antics. For instance, when they called the men in to question them to sit for a jury, they found that all of the men who were called to serve on the jury in some way worked for the Delancey family. And of course would not have ever found against the way they wanted them to find. So those guys were all struck, and they had to get a whole bunch of new people in for the jury. But by this time, Mr. Hamilton had arrived, and the jury selection was a much more rigorous, we'll say, after his arrival. The trial did go on for 9 months because at that time, trials were not contiguous the way they are in your time. They would do a few days and then they would adjourn for a while, then they would do a few days and they would adjourn for a while. So it really took some time to get through this trial, which was great for the governor and the Delancey faction, or so they thought, because they thought the paper would not be printed during that time. But they weren't so lucky because Mrs. Anazanger and her apprentice put out the paper every week, not missing one issue. She said she met every day with her husband at the jail. She went over the submitted stories. She worked them out with him. They decided what would be in the paper, and she went back to the shop, and with the apprentice, she put out that paper. Now, printing a newspaper in 1735 is an incredibly laborious task. Some of you may have seen these old printing presses. Each little letter is set individually in a box, right? If there are little lines, those are laid. And then each piece of paper, ink is put over the box, and each piece of paper is rolled over it one at a time. It's hung up to dry. That would be, say, page 1 and 4. And then page 2 and 3, the two inner pages are laid out. Paper's turned over, it's run through again, and now you have your 4 pages. Very difficult to do, but not one issue was missed. And Mrs. Zenger also printed the trial transcript in the paper so that anyone who couldn't fit into the courtroom was packed every day, but anyone who couldn't fit into the courtroom also had a transcript of what happened in the trial. And it was really an incredible trial with both sides pulling out all the stops, as you might say, to win. Mr. Hamilton saying, being very, what do I want to say, controversial, and coming right out and saying, yes, Mr. Zenger printed this newspaper. He says, we don't deny that he printed the newspaper, shocking the other side. He said, what we do deny is that it is a libel because it is true. And then he went on to argue that if a libel is true, it cannot be a libel, even though British law said that it was a libel, even if it was true, because it could hurt the party about whom it was published. Andrew Hamilton argued loudly against this, and he argued many other things too about secret trials and all kinds of things we really don't find relevant today because we have a different legal system. But in the end, when he gave his closing argument, he really played to the New York jurors, and he said to them, as intelligent, capable men, does it make sense to you that we would judge truth and falsehood in the same way? It makes no sense. He said, if something is true, it cannot be a libel. And isn't truth printed in our newspapers the only way we have to keep a check on crown corruption? And incredibly, the jury adjourned. It only took them 15 minutes after 9 months to return their verdict, and their verdict was to nullify the libel law in colonial New York. They nullified the libel law, and they amended it to say that a libel was only a libel if it was knowingly false. In other words, the printer had to know they were printing a falsehood in order to be charged with libel. So of course, after that, all the printers just said, I didn't know it was a lie. How did I know? I don't have time to check everything. But it was groundbreaking because it did establish the free press in the colony of New York, and likely would not have been as successful had Anazanger not been putting out the newspaper every week with the trial transcript for everyone to see. So our first woman to honor tonight is Mrs. Anazanger, who put out the weekly journal for 9 months during her husband's famous trial. And of course, you do know that when it came time to ratify the Constitution, New York insisted on a First Amendment, which included the freedom of the press. So thank you, Anazanger. Most history books remember Mr. Zenger, but they do not remember Anazanger. So she's our first lady for tonight, Anazanger. And I'm going to just take a quick look to see if anybody has any questions about Mrs. Zenger. Okay. Oh, someone is in Manassas. Today on my private social media, I posted a lovely picture of our former Q dog, all 105 glorious pounds of him posing at Manassas a number of years ago. He was a wonderful dog, G.I. Joe, a lovely German Shepherd. And some of you, of course, knew our dog, Lance Q. And in a few weeks, Quintus Q will be joining us. And you can be sure that when he gets here, I will hold him up for you all to see. So we will have a new Q dog at the end of June, I think. So on to our next lady, who has to do with the prison ships docked in the East River during the American Revolution. And this was not a woman who spent any time on the prison ships, but a woman who helped rescue men from those prison ships. And her name is Elizabeth Bergen. And many people don't know about Elizabeth Bergen, but she is an astounding woman. I think she was a widow. She lived in New York with her children, and she was a peddler. She sold various types of small items to earn a living. And Thomas Dring, in his book about the way he survived the Jersey, and this is Captain Dring's drawing of the Jersey prison ship as he remembered it from spending time on it, wrote a little bit about Elizabeth Bergen. Now, for those of you who don't know, during the 7 years of military occupation of the city, the British kept a series of ships anchored in the Wallabout Bay in Brooklyn in the East River that they used to house prisoners. These are mostly naval prisoners. Some are not. Some are also criminals from the town, people they think are spies, or people who've committed other types of crimes on these prison ships. And the Jersey especially was the most deadly of those prison ships. Virtually everyone condemned to the Jersey died on the Jersey. Conditions on these ships were unbelievable. Captain Dring said that the night he arrived, it was pitch dark. He couldn't see anything, but the stench was overwhelming and he nearly fainted from it. He said when he woke up the next day, he saw on the deck where he was placed, it was just wall to wall men living in the most incredible misery. He said misery you could not even imagine. And as I mentioned, many men died. He said most men just gave up their will to live and just laid down and died. They were fed maggot, infested food, rotting food. It was just horrible conditions. And every morning they asked for volunteers to move up to the deck and throw off the dead from the night before. They did this on all the ships. And Captain Dring said that he volunteered to do this because it gave him fresh air and it also allowed him out on deck to smoke because he liked to smoke. And this is when he tells the story of the various peddler ladies who would come up along the side of the ship. Because if you had family members, they could give you money. They could come up along the side of the ship and you could lower a string and they could pass you up a little bundle with money. And with that money, you could buy things when the peddlers came up along the side of the ship. So you would look down and tell the peddler what you were interested in buying and you'd negotiate over the price. You'd lower down your money and the peddler would raise up, you'd bring up whatever the item was that you bought. Well, apparently Elizabeth Bergen was one of these peddlers who would come up along the side of the ship. She would, negotiate and do her little transactions. But Captain Dring and many others said that occasionally she would come at dusk, where if a gentleman was courageous enough, he might dive off of the ship into her boat. She would cover him with all the wares and she would take him to New Jersey to safety. Now, some people say this is not the way she helped gentlemen, that some of them she helped escape from the prisons in New York City. And so that would be like the Sugar House or the Bridewell or the Provost Jail, and that she helped those men, secreted them in her boat and took those men to New Jersey. So there's a little bit of discrepancy over just which prisoners, although Thomas Dring seems to believe she was one of these peddlers. She helped more than 200 men escape the prisons of New York. And the reason we know she did this is that she was granted a pension by General Washington for services she provided. Now, things got kind of hot in New York for Mrs. Bergen when the English found out from an informant that she was helping prisoners escape. At that time, she left her children with a friend in New York, and she escaped to Philadelphia. And this is where she came under the protection of General Washington, whose commanders told him of the service she'd provided. Now, she needed to get her children back, and she, created a really circuitous route up to the Hudson River, up through Pennsylvania and New Jersey, to avoid all of the British forces that were there, in order to meet up with her children and bring her children on to Philadelphia. Washington wrote a letter of commendation for Mrs. Bergen. He granted her a lifetime pension. And when she received knowledge of the pension, she wrote back to Washington and asked what she could do to earn it. And he said she had already earned it in his mind. And she said, no, she had not. And instead, she spent the rest of the war sewing tunics for the soldiers, because she said it was wrong for anyone to receive payment without work. And so we have a great lady, and I think the beginnings of that good old American work ethic, that colonial work ethic, that if you receive money, you should be doing something to receive it. Elizabeth Bergen, a great lady. I'm not sure if she ever returned to New York or whether she stayed in Philadelphia, but one of the ladies that actually received a commendation from General Washington for her bravery here during the occupation of New York. And by the way, you can find Captain Dring's firsthand account on the Jersey online. You can always email me or send me a message if you'd like to read it. I can send you a link to the PDF. And it is an incredibly harrowing story of what it was like to be on that prison ship. Oh, I should say before we depart from Mrs. Bergen that many of those bodies that were thrown off of the ships began to come out of the muck and mud, and they were all eventually removed from the East River, and they lie in a beautiful vault in Brooklyn at I forgot the name of the park. Can you believe I forgot the name of the park? It's a beautiful park in Brooklyn, and I've posted a video from there. I'm so embarrassed. A beautiful park in Brooklyn where they have an eternal flame, and it's surrounded by eagles, and all of those men are interred there. Let's see if anybody has told me the name of the park in Brooklyn. Let's see. We have someone on Facebook who says, read she may have been Culper 355. What are my thoughts? Well, I appeared on a show on the History Channel in which I was asked that very question: was Elizabeth Bergen 355? And I said, no. And the host of the show wanted me to say it and wanted me to say it and wanted me to say it. And I would not say it. And my part got cut down to only 4 minutes. It was originally 15 minutes. And he got so annoyed that I was cut to 4 minutes. So there you go. Of course, I would have liked the 15 minutes, but I didn't want to say it was Elizabeth Bergen because I really don't believe 355 was her. She just doesn't fit the profile at all. But she was an incredibly brave lady because, if the British caught her, she would have found herself on the Jersey and she would have died there. A miserable death. Imagine being a woman on the Jersey prison ship, and there were women condemned to the Jersey. So I don't think Mrs. Bergen was 355. And I've suffered greatly in my TV exposure as a result of that. But that just gives you an idea of how much I don't want to say anything I'm not willing to back up. Let's see. Are they still finding skeletons? No, I don't think so. I think that has all been removed and sent over to the fort in Brooklyn, the name of which hopefully I'll remember before the end of our time together tonight. Let's see. All right, so our next lady you have probably all heard of. And let's find, I do have a picture of her. Of course, only wealthy ladies have pictures, right? So we don't have a picture of Anazanger or Elizabeth Bergen, but this is a very wealthy lady. So we have many portraits of her, but this is my favorite. And some of you might know who this is. This is Sarah Livingston Jay, Mrs. John Jay, or the Miss Sarah Livingston, daughter of the great William Livingston. And I love this portrait of Mrs. Jay. And she is really an astounding lady in New York history. First of all, she is the daughter of the great William Livingston, who is the father-in-law of John Jay. Now, I mentioned those two lawyers in the Zenger trial, Smith and Alexander. Well, they eventually were reinstated at the bar of New York, and they took on a young clerk, a graduate of King's College named named William Livingston. So William Livingston learned the law from the two radical lawyers who were successful in bringing us freedom of the press. He then taught a young graduate of King's College named John Jay, who went on to become our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And John Jay married Mr. Livingston's daughter, Sarah. And by all accounts, it was a match of true love and respect. Now, Sarah, I think, was only 17 when she married Jay, who might have been about 10 years older than her at the time. He was quite a bit older than her when they married, but it was true love. They loved each other dearly, and the letters between them are quite beautiful and very loving. And of course, when they're first married, it's the time of the Revolutionary War, so they're separated quite a bit as John is off serving in the Continental Congress and Sarah is still living at her home in New Jersey. But during the war, you might remember, Mr. Jay is sent to Europe as a diplomat, and Mrs. Jay accompanies him. Now, together they had 6 children, 3 of them born abroad during his years of diplomacy. And Mr. Jay later credited his wife for his great success as a diplomat. Because, of course, although the opinions of women were maybe not so valued here in America, in the courts of Europe, there were some very renowned ladies. And it was often the ladies one had to go through to get the interest of the husbands. And you know, Benjamin Franklin worked that very well in France, didn't he? He figured that out right away and kind of found the way into the hearts of the ladies of France, and therefore found himself into the pocketbooks of their husbands. So Jay really had to do a little bit of the same. And he credited Sarah's not only her social skills, but her great intellect and education in being helpful in that, as the Livingston daughters were very well educated. They were educated, of course, in English and French, also in the classics, as their father would have wanted them to know some of that, and they probably knew a little bit of Latin as well. And he said that it was her felicity of knowledge of history, geography, cultures, classics, and her great social skills that opened so many doors for him as a diplomat in France, Spain, and Holland. Mrs. Jay, it is said, was so beautiful and so graceful in Paris that one night in the theater, the audience stood and applauded her, believing her to be Queen Marie Antoinette. So lovely, Mrs. Jay, a great asset to her husband. Now, when they returned to America, Jay, of course, became first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And during the years he served as Justice in New York, Mrs. Jay was known to hold the finest weekly banquet, afternoon banquet, and the greatest salons where some of the most important diplomatic deals were conducted. So receiving an invitation to Mrs. Jay's salon was considered a great compliment at that time, where you would find many foreign diplomats and many great people here talking and working out their plans for various deals they were making. So again, that's Sarah Jay's great ability to bring people together, to initiate conversation between them, and to know who the best people were to pair up with each other or to bring together into a group to make the greatest success come around or greatest success happen. So those are all talents the greatest ladies of that time had, those social talents. Social talents didn't just mean you were talkative and you were pretty, but it meant you knew to seat the right people with each other to initiate the conversation, you knew to invite the right people to the event, and you knew how to facilitate that conversation. So those were all very important talents for the wives of diplomats, and Mrs. Jay was incredible at it. Her husband, you know, went on to serve as governor of New York, so she was our first lady of New York for a time. And sadly, Jay had spent most of their lives together in service. Right at the time they got married, he was already a member of the Continental Congress, I think. And so there was Continental Congress, and there was diplomacy, and then there was the negotiating of the Treaty of France, and then some more diplomacy, then Chief Justice, and then Governor. And he built a beautiful retirement home for them near Katona, New York. It is the John Jay Homestead. Everyone should visit it. It's one of my favorite historic places in all of New York. It is so wonderful, the John Jay Homestead. And of course, see many portraits of Sarah Livingston Jay there, and a wonderful portrait of her father as a boy is up there as well. Great place to visit. Well, John built this working farm for her, and only 1 year after they retired there, she became ill and she passed away. And as I walk around, anytime I go there, as I walk around there, I always think of Jay's heartbreak. You know, he wrote about his heartbreak at having spent so many years apart from his wife and having had only a little more than one to give her of his, devotion. So very heartbreaking for him. His son and wife and their children moved into the home, and you can see a little schoolhouse Jay built for them and a little playhouse. And that, of course, added some life and gaiety to his life there at the homestead. And one of my greatest things I like to do when I'm there. Jay was very wealthy. He owned many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres there. And he built a very low-key home, unlike some other people we're not talking about tonight who went into debt building their homes. We're going to talk about those two guys momentarily. I'm going to speak about one. But I always thought about Jay standing there on the, patio or porch of his home, looking down the dirt road off into the farms in the distance and the greenery, and seeing a rider arrive from New York and wondering, what is this about? I'm not expecting anyone. Probably wasn't dressed up, probably dressed in his farm clothes or his, chore clothes, and a rider coming up and telling, Governor Jay, I'm sorry to tell you, but your good friend, Mr. Hamilton, has died in a duel. And I always think of Jay just standing there thinking about first the loss of his wife, and 2 years later, I think the loss of his good friend, Alexander Hamilton. And Jay now having, been retired and thinking about the past now and how all of that is behind him. And I hope finding some joy in his grandchildren who were there. And he had other daughters who stayed around as well for a time. So our third lady, the great Sarah Livingston Jay. And I wonder if any of you have heard of any of these three ladies. I know I see someone, is it Fort Greene? Yes, it's Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Thank you. Named for Nathaniel Greene. Of course, I should remember that, but I didn't. Thank you so much. It is a wonderful place. A few people told me it was Fort Greene. Thank you. Fort Greene, also a highly recommended place for you to visit if you're visiting New York City. And it's a lovely old neighborhood too. Let me see if we have any other questions or comments. So do you have any questions about our three ladies tonight? I think these conversations about the ladies may have the workings of a tour in them. What do you think? I think maybe Mrs. Q is going to have to do a great ladies of colonial and founding New York City tour. See, Mrs. Healy says, in the beginning, when you said I was nodding my head, closed captioning translated it as she is not in her head. Oh, I love it. She's not in her head. Oh, I really like that. That might be true for me as well. I don't know, this hair here and everything. Mr. Jensen says a great ladies tour sounds great. And I am thinking the Great Ladies Tour is in the works, and it is a tour I'm going to do live and in person, but I am also going to do a video version of that tour, and it's going to be one of the first tours I release fully on video that you can buy and watch on video. It's going to be one of the first ones I do. Hello from Glasgow, Scotland. Well, to our Scottish friends who helped us in the American Revolution. Many of our friends here in New York during the Revolutionary War were Scots. Our leaders of the Sons of Liberty are many of our commanders. So thank you to the Scots who were here in America and aided us in our fight against the English. And I think that you in Scotland maybe still do not like them in England so much. I think you may still be having conflicts with them. Maybe we've worked ours out. People like the video tour idea, wonderful. Okay, so I'll get on with that video tour. I think it will likely, to give you a hint, will start with the great merchant Margaret Hardenbrook, who arrived in the 1620s, and it will end with a lady of the 19th century, Mrs. Theodosia Burr Alston, and we'll hit all of them in between. And we'll kind of see the development of the role of ladies, or maybe we should say the role of ladies during the Dutch period, and then the way that role kind of falls off during the colonial period, and the way it grows again in the founding period. I think it'd be lots of fun. So thank you all for joining me tonight again, and for liking my new hairdo. I think it's quite becoming. Look at that. Wow. That came out really good. I'm getting pretty good at this. And yes, I will see you all next week. In 2 weeks is my Queen's Library lecture. So I will be here again next week. And I'll try to think of a great topic that we can all talk about. In the meantime, I'll see you all on social media, and have a wonderful weekend and a great week. And I hope spring has come to you like it finally has come to us in New York. Have a great week. Be safe and healthy. And I'll see you next time. Bye.